Let's learn how to control the opacity of an image or color correction or material or anything your heart can dream of using a slider. Okay, so I'm just here in Lynn Studio with a blank project. And before I start creating anything over here, let's go ahead and download a pre-built slider component from the Lynn Studio website. So if you come here, you can go to the guides, scripting, helper scripts, user interface, or you can just search for user interface. You can see here there's a collection of some buttons and this color picker. So all you need to do is click download to the UI system. This will download the zip file. So once you unzip that, you'll get this uiwidgets.lso file. So if we come back to Lynn Studio, we can just drag that in to our resources panel. So you get a new folder called UI. You can see there's different scripts and textures and whatnot. And after just a moment, we should see this place under orthographic camera object be added to our scene. So it's disabled. Let's go ahead and enable it. But we don't have an orthographic camera, so we aren't going to see anything yet. So let's go ahead and create one. So let's create a new camera. Now I want my slider to only be visible to the person creating the snap. I don't want it in the final product. So I'm actually going to output this camera to a separate render target. So in the resources panel, let's add a render target, rename this to UI render target. If we come back to my camera, I can now have the output of this camera going to that UI render target. And then I also like to just put it on a new layer, just to keep everything nice and organized. And this all, of course, needs to be an orthographic camera. So now let's drag this UI stuff under the UI cam. And you can see it is all showing up here, but we have nothing in our preview. And that's because in our scene config, we are for both the capture target, which is what is captured by the snap, and the live target, which is what you see while you're creating it. They're both set to the render target, but our UI is going to the UI render target. So in live target, just switch that over, and you still aren't going to see anything. That's because by default, everything in here is on the orthographic layer, or this green layer here. You can see that up here. So let's go ahead and change that to our UI layer. So just to quickly show that, I'll take the tap hint. If I move it to the UI layer, now it shows up. Now I don't want to keep that hint, so I'm going to delete it. And I'm just going to delete these buttons and toggles. I don't want those. We want just a slider. So now you can see we have a few different things here. We have a color picker, a slider, and a discrete picker. So the discrete picker, it's kind of like a slider, not really. You can just choose between a few different values. So we're going to delete that. Now we're left with the color picker and the UI slider. Now, if we come back to the Lynn Studio page, now you can see they only have these three button types, so the toggle, these two buttons, and the color picker slider. They don't have any documentation for that just normal slider. So I'm going to keep using the color picker in this video rather than the normal slider, just because we have some documentation here for the scripting, which we are going to be using scripting. So I'd rather have some documentation than not. And the real reason is because I already created the written version of this tutorial, and I did it with the color picker, not the UI slider, and I don't want to rewrite it. So I'm just going to delete that. Okay, so let's make our color picker visible. So I'm just going to expand everything out. I'm going to click the bottom element, hold shift, select the top one, move that to my new layer. Now I have a slider. Now the last thing here, we aren't choosing colors, so let's take all these color things off. So the pop-up is what kind of pops up to the side. Oh, I have everything selected. So we can take that off. So we're just sliding. We don't need this color visual inside the cursor. So now we just have a white cursor, and now this color background, that is this palette here. If I disable that, I lose the cursor because the cursor is a child of the palette. So I'm just going to drag the cursor out to the background, and now it is working. Now you can stick with the default slider images here, that cursor circle, and then this kind of elongated rounded rectangle for the background. Feel free to change those images. You just select it here, load in your image. If you want to use these existing images as references, if you've saved your project so as a name, here in the resources panel you can actually find the different images. You'll see a preview, and you can show in Explorer to find where the file is. Then you can open it up and use it as a template or edit it in your graphics editor of choice. But I'm just going to stick with the default slider for now. All right, so we have the camera set up. We have our slider set up. So let's go ahead and collapse all of that. And in the scene config, we have our capture target and our live target. So just to double check that, if I click on the device here in the preview panel, switch to capture mode, our slider disappears. And that's great. Now we can come back to live camera, and our slider's back. So that's all working perfectly. Now the last thing we need to do is we need to make sure that our render target, which is what we're actually capturing, is also visible for this UI, because this UI camera is actually just going to pull in the device camera texture without any effects. So just to show what that actually means, I'm going to add, let's just add a sphere. I'm just going to parent it to the camera, and let's move it out so we can see it. So we have the sphere in our scene. We don't see it here. If we switch to capture mode, we do see the sphere. So this is what I'm talking about. We want to make sure that this sphere, anything in our scene, is also visible here in the live camera. So there are two ways we can do that. The first one is on this UI camera, we can create a screen image and just display the render target on it. Or alternatively, having this camera selected, we can come to this clear color option, change this to texture, and now we can choose an input texture for this UI camera. And we can choose render target. Now we have our sphere. So we can move this, we can see that it's changing here. If we come back to our capture mode, we lose the slider but keep everything in our scene. So that is our last piece of setup. So this clear color is just kind of what goes into the camera. If it's set to none, it's just going to pick up the device camera texture, which is just what the camera sees. It's a default texture added when you create a new project. But we can override that with our render target. So our scene gets rendered, then it's put into our UI camera, and then we can display the slider on top of that. All right, so enough with the slider setup. Let's actually start doing something with it. So if we come to the UI color picker, we can see we have some settings here. We can choose a color recipient. There's different options here, but what we actually want to do is we're going to write our own script, and we aren't actually going to change any of the UI color picker script things right here. So we don't need to worry about that. We're just going to create our own script. And if you are not a coder, the entire script, there will be a link in the video description. You can go to that page, see the entire written version of this tutorial, and you can just copy and paste the script if you don't want to code anything. And it will just work. but since this is a tutorial, we're going to go ahead and create the script from scratch. So let's create a script. We'll call this alpha controller. And then I want to go ahead and add it to the scene. So I'm just going to select something over here in the objects panel, click off of it. I'll drag that script over here, and we are good. So I'll call this alpha control script. Okay, so we have our script. It's in the scene. Now just to make sure our slider goes into the script and that our script does something. So I have the codes written. So we're going to go ahead and go over it here in my code editor because I like the way it looks a little better. And then we'll jump back into Lens Studio and copy and paste it. So the first thing we're going to do is we have some different inputs for our script. So the first thing I'm going to specify is a string input, but instead of just typing in a value, I'm actually going to create a widget. So the widgets, if we come back to the Lens Studio website, if we search for custom UI, we have a custom script UI page. And so this is just going to tell us how to, instead of have these just kind of plain inputs, give us a little more control over what's shown. And let's change, instead of just typing in a value, we can have this kind of combo box and choose something. So if you want to learn a little more about it, there's this whole page here about everything you can do with it. But for our purposes, let's come back to here. And this here is JSON. It's a JSON object, but it all has to fit on one line to be in this comment input. But if we take a look at it, we're specifying the widget is a combo box, and these are the different values. So label is what is displayed, value is what the actual input will be. So here, if I select image, then my script input will take on the value of image with a lowercase I. And so I have image, post effect, material, and graph material. And so if I want to access my script.entity string, it will be one of these four values: image, post, mat, or graph. All right, so this is just going to be letting us choose what object we want to control the opacity of. The reason being, it's all going to be slightly different. Most of it's the same, but there are a few small differences. Next, we're going to have an image component input. And here, our custom script UI is a little simpler. We aren't specifying a widget. We're just going to say show if entity, which is our first input here. A show if value is image. So if we select image for that first input, then Lens Studio will select an image component. If we have a value of post, then we'll be able to choose a post effect. We'll be able to choose a material if we choose just the regular material. And then the graph material will be if we choose the graph material in our first input. And we're going to have, besides just material, we're going to have a few other values we'll also go over later. And then for no matter what we choose up here, we're going to have an initial value, which is what our slider starts at. And then the color picker scripts we can plug into that. So these are all the inputs. So let's go ahead and copy this over to Lens Studio just to take a look at how this is going to initially look. All right, so I have this here. I saved my script. Now if I come over here, I can choose my entity. So now I can choose an image. I can choose a post effect. I can choose a material, or I can choose a graph material, and then I have these extra inputs here. And then this initial value always showed up, and the color picker script always shows up. And while we're here, let's just go ahead and select that. So we want the UI color picker : script. All right. So after we choose our inputs, we actually want to do something with our code. So we're going to ignore this function handle change for now. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our color picker script, so script.colorpickerScript, and then this .api is because over here on the Lens Studio page for the UI elements, there are some methods exposed by the slider that we can plug into. And Lens Studio does that by adding this .api thing on the end of the script stuff. So we come back to here. So we have our color picker script .api .add callback. And our callback is going to be on slider value changed. So anytime the slider changes, Lens Studio will run this function. And we get to choose what that function is. So whenever the slider value changes, we're going to pass our function to the color picker. And so as that's changing, it will run our function for us, essentially. And then we're going to take our initial value. We'll go ahead and call our function with that initial value to kind of sync everything up. And then our color picker script, we have script.colorpickerScript.api.setSliderValue, which is, again, from here, we can set the slider value. Now we can also get the slider value, but the callback takes care of that. And so these two lines are just going to make sure that we set the opacity to our initial slider value and set the slider value itself to that initial value. All right, so this is all just kind of like setting stuff up. So let's get into the actual kind of meat of the script. All right, so this handle change function, it will receive the slider value. So on a scale from 0 to 1. So our slider at the bottom will be 0. Up at the top, it'll have a value of 1. So we're just going to go and print that out just so we can see what's going on in the logger. And then I decided to use a switch statement to handle what happens for each type of input. So the switch, we give it a value, so it'll be our script.entity. So that is this first input, whether it's an image, post effect, material, etc. And so based on that value, we will execute each individual code block. And if it doesn't match anything here, it'll just break, it just won't do anything. So if we have image selected, then we will take our image input. We're going to select the main pass and set the base color to this new value. Now, the images, we don't directly see this main pass base color stuff. So let's hop into Lens Studio and take a quick look at a material instead to see what that base color stuff is. So I'm just going to add a diffuse material. If I select it, we have this base color here. So the main pass of the material is, you can essentially think of it as just all this information here. So it's a pass, kind of the calculation of how it should look. And we want to set the base color. So the base color is, there are a couple different ways it can work. So if we have a base texture, then this color gets mixed with the image texture. So if it's white, we'll just see the plain regular image. If we change this base color, it will add that hue to the image. So now I'll still have that kind of texture image, that image texture on my material, but now it's going to be kind of red. Now with the images, the base color we're assuming is always white, so we just see the image. So how the script works is we're going to just set the base color to white, which is 1, 1, 1 for the red, green, and blue channels. Here in the scripting, it's not a 0 to 255 scale. Like you might usually see with colors, it's a 0 to 1 scale. And then the fourth channel, the opacity, will set to the value of the slider. And so that is how this image will receive its transparency. The same thing goes for the post effect. It's all the same except we're inputting a post effect. Now there are a few caveats with this. We'll take a look at that in Lens Studio in just a minute. For the material, it's going to be a little different because if we want our material to actually just be a color versus having a base texture, so the sphere here, let's go ahead and give it our texture, or I mean our material. If we turn off base texture and set the base color to something, we don't want to reset this to white every time the opacity changes. So in our script, we're going to grab the current color, so whatever the base color is. And then when we set the new base color, we'll grab the current red, green, and blue values, and then set our new alpha value. And now moving on to the graph material, the opacity is a little different for these. We don't necessarily have this base color. So what we're going to do is we still access the main pass, but now we're going to pass in a custom property. We'll pass in our opacity value, and then we have this optional multiplier. And we will take a look at that in action in Lens Studio. So I'm just going to copy all of this, paste it in here. And now hopefully as we go through this will all start to make a little more sense. Now you might see we get an error here in the logger, and that's because we have our graph material, but we don't have an actual graph material set. So let's start simple. Let's start with just an image. And so I'm going to add a screen image. So the use case here would be like if you have some grain or something added and you want the user to be able to change the opacity. We'll let them use the slider to do that. Now you might notice I added a new screen image. We get the orthographic camera, the screen image, but nothing showed up here. The reason for that is in the scene config, we have our original camera, our UI camera, and then after that we're rendering our new orthographic camera. Now since our render target is feeding into the UI camera, we need to make sure that this gets rendered before the UI render target. And so all I did was you can just click and drag things around, and once I did that, our screen image shows up. And our alpha control script, let's come select that. We have our image entity. Let's find our orthographic camera screen image. And now we have our initial value at 0.5, and you should see that this image is now somewhat transparent. So I can drag this up to 1, drag this down to 0, and our image opacity changes. So that is working perfectly. Now this initial value, if we set that to 1, when our lens starts, our slider will start up at 1. Our image will be, we'll have an alpha of 1, so it's visible. Slider still works, or alternatively, we can start at 0 or any value in between. So that's the initial value in action. All right, so that's pretty easy for the image. All we do once we have our slider and our script added, we just make sure that our image is selected and it just works perfect. Now, one quick note before we keep going. This alpha control script, since we are reading in the UI color picker script, it needs to be placed below the color picker script here. So if I were to move this above the UI camera, we're going to get an error because the callback doesn't exist because the color picker script hasn't run yet. So we can either drag it back down or change this from initialized to lens turned on. So it's a small detail, but just something to be aware of. Okay, so we can control the image opacity. So let's go ahead and just turn the image off for now. And let's take a look at what else we can control. So let's go to post effect. Let's go ahead and add a post effect. Now, I know my script says post effect, but it does not work on any arbitrary post effect. It's meant for the color corrections. So I have this black and white color correction. So it just makes everything black and white. If I select that post effect here on my opacity script, now you can see if I go down to 0, there's no more color correction. If I go up to 1, then it's all color correction. So not only can we change the opacity of images, we can also control the strength of the color corrections. With our same script, all we gotta do is just select post effect here. All right, so that's pretty cool. Let's turn that off, and let's bring our sphere back because we did give that a new material. So let's select our alpha control script. Let's go to material, and let's choose that diffuse material. And you can see as we move our slider, nothing's actually happening. Now, the reason for that is our material, the blend mode is disabled. So what we have to do is just change that to normal to make sure that it's kind of blending into the scene correctly. So now you see it's halfway transparent. And if we move our slider, we can also change the opacity of our material. All right, so far that's been pretty easy. Now let's take a look at the graph material. This is going to be a little different. So let's really quickly create a graph material. So a graph material is one for which we can open the material editor. So if I select my material, I can go into graph editor, and now I have all this stuff here. So let's expand this out a little bit. All right, so you can see here, if I have my material selected, we have different graph parameters. These are inputs. And so what we can do is we have an opacity value for our shader. So let's go ahead and add a float parameter and plug that in. Now you can see we have this new custom float input for our material. Now I'm going to change the name to, if I can type, I'll change it to, still can't type, opacity. So now we have opacity here. And then the script name, I also want to set that to opacity. I'm going to use lowercase o. And then let's enable min, enable max. And now we have a slider. So as I move this slider, you can see in this preview, my material is appearing or disappearing because we're changing the opacity. All right, so let's go ahead and add that material to our sphere. Let's swap that out for our graph PBR. And now on the alpha control script, let's select that. Now if I move the slider, nothing is going to happen. That's because we need to say which property we want to use as the opacity property. So if I select my material here, really quick, we also need to make sure this is normal blend mode. So you see we have our opacity here working with this slider, but not our slider. So what we need to do is hover our mouse over opacity, and we can see the property is opacity with a lowercase o. And that is this script name we set here. So if we copy that, come to alpha control script and put property here, now our material disappears, our slider doesn't work. That's because we have this extra multiplier. So let's set this to 1. And now our slider works. So that seemed like a little bit of extra work to have this extra property and this multiplier, but it's going to make this script a little more flexible. So for changing the opacity, it's great. We can rename our parameter whatever we want, and we can set it here. For example, we have multiple opacities involved or different values, whatever you like. But this extra multiplier, since it's just a value of 1, is pretty useless here. Not useless, we need it, of course. Maybe unnecessary. We could assume that our opacity is just 0 to 1. But we can use this with other graph materials too. So I'm going to add a Gaussian blur post effect. So now the entire scene is blurry, And we get this new Gaussian blur graph material. And if we look here, we have this blur factor we can control. So if I hover my mouse, I see the property is blur factor. So lowercase b, no space, capital F. And I can adjust that up to 5, down to 0. And we can also connect our slider. Instead of controlling the opacity of the material, we can control this blur factor. So let's come back to here. Let's choose our Gaussian blur material. I'm going to choose blur factor. And now I can have no blur. If I come up to the top value of the slider though, I don't get much blur. That's because the Gaussian blur material can go up to 5, but the slider only goes up to 1. So I change my multiplier to 5. And now I can control the full range of that blur factor. So it's not strictly opacity, but it might as well have the ability to control other graph material parameters as well. And this initial value, of course, still works. My numpad's not working, but the slider works. So we can start at 0, we can start at 1, we can start anywhere we want. And that is essentially that. So we can control the opacity of images, color corrections, materials, graph materials, and then we can also slightly adapt it to control any other parameter for a graph material. So I forgot to actually show you this Gaussian blur really quick. So you can also come into the material, you can find that float parameter, and so you can see the script name. This is that property we put on our script. So any parameter here, any float parameter, we can control with our alpha control script. So that's pretty cool. Gives us a lot of flexibility in what we can do now. So it is mostly just the setup, making sure our slider is set up, having your separate render targets, and then it's really just a question of pasting the script in and choosing what we want to control. So let's turn our image back on. And so we can now adjust our image, and you'll notice our blur isn't changing. Our script is only going to change whatever is selected. So even though I didn't clear the screen image input, I can cycle through all these. So you aren't going to control everything at once with the slider. It's just whatever is currently active at the time. Now if I switch to the capture mode, we can see our effect here, but without the slider component. So I don't think this tutorial is too rambly. Hopefully you were able to learn something from all that. But if you want to control the opacity of essentially anything, this script is all you need. Once again, in the video description, there's a link to the page where you can just copy and paste the script. And you don't need to worry about coding that up on your own or remembering how it works. Just remembering that it does work and how to use it.